Okay, hello. My name's Chris Millard and I'm from the Department of History. And I'm going to talk to you today about something a little bit dark, the history of child abuse. My interest is actually in the history of medicine and the history of psychiatry and psychology. But I'm interested in the way that one of the ways that we become aware of child abuse and child maltreatment in the 20th century is really closely connected to hospitals, and specifically NHS hospitals. Now, the concern about child abuse as we now understand it, as we understand it in the modern world, emerges actually in Denver, Colorado. There's a pediatrician called Henry Kemp, and he and his colleagues in 1961 published a provocatively titled paper called The Battered Baby. And in this paper, it comes out of their practice of what's called routine pediatric X-ray. So you give X-rays to every single small child that comes in, just to check. And what they find is more and more children have healing fractures. And these fractures are not accounted for by the parents. And so they sit and they think, well, there's something fishy here. And eventually what happens is that they start to argue that these children are being violently physically abused. Now, this doesn't really catch on so much in the UK, a little bit with the NSPCC, the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, but it really explodes in the UK in the mid-1970s with the scandal over the maltreatment of a 9-year-old girl called Maria Colwell, who's beaten to death by her stepfather when supposedly under local authority supervision in January 73, and there's a big inquiry and a report in 1974. So people start getting more clued up to this thing called child abuse. And only a few years later, a pediatrician from Leeds called Roy Meadow, he publishes his first case in what he calls Munchausen syndrome by proxy, which is a very weird form of child abuse, very odd, where the parents repeatedly, over and over again, present their child at hospital as if they are ill, but in fact it turns out after months and months that these parents are fabricating the symptoms or they're inducing them. So there's a case where a child is poisoned with salt, a child is poisoned with tranquilizers, or where a mother adds blood to her child's urine samples to force multiple investigations. And this is what Roy Meadow calls the hinterland of child abuse. But as well as that, there's a slightly paradoxical way in which this form of child abuse becomes visible, how it becomes a concern. And this is actually in the way that hospitals become aware that children need emotional support. There's a concern over what's called HospitalISM in the 1940s, where children, their mortality rate, the rate at which they die, is so much higher if they don't get visited by their parents. And a very influential psychologist by the name of John Bowlby, he publishes a report into the horrible consequences for children if they don't have their mothers to look after them in early life. And what happens in children's wards, when children go in for routine procedures that take, say, a week, lots of hospitals don't allow their parents to visit them, because they're worried about germs, they're worried about introducing infections. But actually, what Bowlby says is that this is not the main concern here. What we want to do is to make sure that these children don't get psychologically traumatized by the absence of their parents, specifically the absence of their mother. It's more important, says Bowlby, to let the mothers in so the children are then much more content, and psychologically they have a much better chance of A, getting better, and B, not having problems in later life to do with anxiety or to do with abandonment. And this is taken up by the British government, who published a report in the late 50s recommending that hospitals massively liberalise their visiting policies. And Roy Meadow, at the start of his career, the man who names Munchausen by proxy, this rather odd form of child abuse, he's really interested in the presence of mothers in hospitals. So he writes 2 articles where he looks at mothers who feel anxious about staying in hospital. And he says, well, these mothers, they need to be cared for, they need to be managed. The nursing staff also need to change their attitudes towards mothers. So there's a big medical concern, if you like, around the presence of parents, predominantly mothers, in hospitals. And it's this concern that fires him up when he's looking at this hinterland of child abuse, this Munchausen by proxy. Because one of the things that he says that really, really caught my eye was he says, it's ironic to conjecture that these cases would have been discovered much more swiftly in the old days of limited visiting and in the absence of facilities for mothers to live in hospital with their children. So here's this wonderful, compassionate change in policy where mothers have facilities to live in and they never have to leave their children's side. But it turns dark when we combine it with this awareness of child abuse. It turns out that a tiny fraction of these mothers are using that closeness, they're using that access to children to manipulate tests, to poison their children, and it's very difficult to associate the onset of severe symptoms with mother's presence if the mother is always there. And so what they start to do is to get nurses to keep a very close eye on these mothers and then withdraw that surveillance. And if the symptoms start to correspond with the withdrawal of that surveillance, then they think they've got it. So I suppose the points that I want to make here is that we think of child abuse as something monstrous, something outside of our normal lives, outside of what we can normally consider even thinkable. And it is, it really is. But we also, I think, need to recognize that child abuse has a history. Child abuse has relations with certain social structures, with certain ideas and attitudes, and with certain institutions. And if we are aware of that, and if we can use that to say, well, there are these circumstances under which child abuse becomes visible, then we might also be able to see the places and the times at which child abuse is invisible. Because one of the things that is incredibly striking, if you like, about this modern concern about child maltreatment is how long it's been going on and how much silence there has been. But part of the issues there are that it's not just about people not saying anything, it's about how institutions are set up in certain ways to preserve themselves and not necessarily to preserve the status, the safety of these children. Thank you very much.